Hello and welcome to the New Republic Salon. I'm Laura Marsh. I'm the literary editor of the New Republic. Today I'm talking with Louis Menand about his new book, The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War. So we're going to start with a reading, then we'll read a bit more from the book, talk a little more, and then we will have a chance for some questions from the audience. There is a way of doing questions. So there's this Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If you have any questions while we're talking, you can put them in there and I can ask Luke at the end. Luke, thank you so much for virtually being here. It's great to be talking about this book.
Thank you. And thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. So we thought we would start by my reading some from the preface.
Yeah. I think if you would just want to like introduce the book and then do your first reading.
Yeah. So there's a short preface to the book, and I'm going to read the first few pages of it because I think it just spells out what the argument of the book is, or what the book is trying to cover, put it that way. And then we'll chat about that a little bit and maybe talk a little bit about how I tried to organize the chapters. This book is about a time when the United States was actively engaged with the rest of the world. In the 20 years after the end of the Second World War, the United States invested in the economic recovery of Japan and Western Europe and extended loans to other countries around the world. With the United Kingdom, it created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to support global political stability and international trade. It hosted the new United Nations. Through its government, its philanthropic foundations, its universities, and its cultural institutions, it established exchange programs for writers and scholars, distributed literature around the globe, and sent art from American collections and music by American composers and performers abroad. Its entertainment culture was enjoyed almost everywhere. And it welcomed and adapted art and ideas and entertainment from other countries. Works of literature and philosophy from all over the world were published in affordable translations. Foreign movies were imported and distributed across the country. The number of Americans attending college increased exponentially. Book sales, record sales, and museum attendance soared. Laws were rewritten to permit works of literature and art to use virtually any language and to represent virtually any subject, and to protect almost any kind of speech. American industry doubled its output. Consumer choice expanded dramatically. The income and wealth gap between top earners and the middle class was the smallest in history. The ideological differences between the two major political parties were minor, enabling the federal government to invest in social programs. The legal basis for the social and political equality of Americans of African ancestry was established, and economic opportunities were opened up for women. And around the world, colonial empires collapsed, and in their place rose new independent states. As conditions changed, so did art and ideas. The expansion of the university, of book publishing, of the music business, and of the art world, along with new technologies of reproduction and distribution, speeded up the rate of innovation. Most striking was the nature of the audience. People cared. Ideas mattered, painting mattered, movies mattered, poetry mattered. The way people judged and interpreted paintings, movies, and poems mattered. People believed in liberty and thought it really meant something. They believed in authenticity and thought it really meant something. They believed in democracy, and with some blind spots, in the common humanity of everyone on the planet. They had lived through a worldwide depression that lasted almost 10 years and a world war that lasted almost 6. They were eager for a fresh start. In the same period, Americans, citizens were persecuted and sometimes prosecuted for their political views. Agencies of the government spied on Americans and covertly manipulated non-governmental cultural and political organizations. Immigration policies remained highly restrictive. The United States used its financial leverage to push American goods on foreign markets. It established military bases around the globe and intervened in the internal political affairs of other states, rigging elections, endorsing coups, enabling assassinations, and supporting the extermination of insurgents. A Cold War rhetoric, much of it opportunistic and fear-mongering, was allowed to permeate public life. And the nation invested in a massive and expensive military buildup that was out of all proportion to any threat. A fifth of the population lived in poverty. The enfranchisement of Black Americans and the opening of economic opportunity to women did little to lessen the dominance in virtually every sphere of life of white men. A spirit of American exceptionalism was widespread, as was a quasi-official belief in something called the American way of life, based on an image of normativity that was, to put it mildly, not inclusive. The culture industries, as they expanded, absorbed and commercialized independent and offbeat culture makers, and the university, as it expanded, swallowed up the worlds of creative writing and dissident political opinion. At the end of this period, the country plunged into a foreign war of national independence, from which it could not extricate itself for 8 years. When it finally did in the 1970s, growth leveled off, the economy entered a painful period of adjustment, ideological differences sharpened, and the income gap began rapidly increasing. The United States grew wary of foreign commitments, and other countries grew wary of the United States. And yet, something had happened. An enormous change in America's relations with the rest of the world had taken place. In 1945, there was widespread skepticism, even about Americans, about the value and sophistication of American art and ideas, and widespread respect for the motives and intentions of the American government. After 1965, those attitudes were reversed. The United States lost political credibility, but it had moved from the periphery to the center of an increasingly international artistic and intellectual life. Cultures get transformed not deliberately or programmatically, but by the unpredictable effects of social, political, and technological change, and by random acts of cross-pollination. Ars longa is the ancient proverb, but actually art making is short-term. It is a response to changes in the immediate environment and the consequence of a serendipitous street-level interactions. Between 1945 and 1965, the rate of serendipity increased and the environment changed dramatically, so did art and thought. The transformation of American culture after 1945 was not accomplished entirely by Americans. It came about through exchanges with thinkers and artists from around the world, from the British Isles, France, Germany, and Italy, from Mexico, Canada, and the Caribbean, from decolonizing states in Africa and Asia, from India and Japan. Some of these people were emigres or exiles, and some never visited. Many of the American artists and writers were themselves the children of immigrants. Even in an era of restrictive immigration policies and geopolitical tensions, art and ideas got around. The artistic and intellectual culture that emerged in the United States after the Second World War was not an American product, it was the product of the free world.
Thanks so much for that reading. So the idea that you're presenting there is this one very powerful idea, but the book itself is very long, extremely wide-ranging. You're talking about novelists, artists, philosophers, people who are in government, people who are in the academy, avant-garde artists, but also commercial artists. Like it's sort of like incredibly wide-ranging, and this is in a period that is extremely rich. So my question is sort of, what was the genesis of the book? Was there a particular person or group of people that were the sort of starting point, and then you realized, oh, I can keep following this idea through the next person and the next person, and the next person? Or did you start with the idea and then, okay, so what was the kind of, what was the genesis?
I wanted to start in 1945, the end of the war. And the first person I write about is George Kennan, because he formulated, of course, the doctrine of containment that was guiding U.S. policy up until Vietnam. So I start with him. And then, as you suggested, I asked myself, who's the next person I need to write about? It turned out to be George Orwell. And it kept going like that. So I didn't have a plan, really. I knew where I wanted to end. I wanted to end in 1965, which is when we intervened militarily in Vietnam. But I really followed my nose through the period, picking the things that I thought I should write about next, and mainly looking for kind of major people who had a big impact, people who were well known outside their own fields. And that's how I went through the period. I would say, try to put it in some kind of metaphor for what I was trying to do with the structure of the book, is that, as I suggested in this preface, I'm trying to describe a change that happens over a 20-year period. It's like trying to take a picture of the Earth turning. But I didn't want to do it from 50,000 feet, which is how a normal survey would work. I want to do it from street level. And on street level, you don't feel the Earth turning. You don't feel there's any particular pattern or direction to what's going on. You're doing your thing. And I wanted to capture that, at the same time give the reader the sensation, after going through all these different people, of a change that's taking place. So that when you get to the end, you look back and you think, yes, this change happened through all these seemingly random figures doing their thing, and get a picture of it that way.
How much would you say the idea itself changes over that sort of like 20-year period? Because like you say, you begin with Kennan and then you have this chapter on Orwell, but we end up talking about Jan Wenner
Yeah.
and these figures who, like, I don't know what these, what would Orwell and Jan Wenner have said to each other? That's a really hard conversation to imagine.
Yeah.
They weren't alive at the same time, or they weren't prominent at the same time. Do you see like a fairly straight line developing as you go through the book, or is it more complicated than that, of people kind of zigzagging back and forth in the way they're
it's zigzags, the way history zigzags. It's not a straight line, and I certainly didn't want to give the impression that it was a straight line. It's Elvis Presley's doing something, Jackson Pollock's doing something, Hannah Arendt's doing something. They don't have anything in common. I mean, they don't pay attention to what the other person is doing. But if you sort of put the pieces together in the right order, I think you get a feeling for something that's happening, and they're all playing their role in it in a way that makes sense. But it's not as though, I wrote a book before called The Metaphysical Club about the pragmatists. There's just like a straight line of ideas from one person to another. That's not true of this period at all.
The range of people that you cover is, again, I said, very wide. How do you narrow it down? Like, how did you pick these figures? And also for the audience, could you just give a sense of who they are? I mean, I know there are a lot of people.
I picked figures who I thought were, as I said, came on the scene and made a difference, had an impact, such that everybody knew who they were. So Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, they come on the scene in 1945, right at the end of the war. Paris is liberated in 1944. 1945, everybody else knows what existentialism is. And it gets picked up in the US, it gets picked up in Britain to some extent, and becomes this big set of ideas that permeate people's apprehension about art and about lifestyle and about choices and about whether there's a God and so forth. So they're really important, and they have this enormous impact. Probably 99% of the people who thought they knew what existentialism was didn't read a word that Sartre or Beauvoir wrote, but there's this received notion about existentialism. So that I had to talk about that. Then Hannah Arendt writes a book, Origins of Totalitarianism, which everybody knows now because after Trump got elected, everybody started reading it again, 1951. And that was a very influential idea about how to understand totalitarian systems and the Soviet Union in particular. So I wrote about her. Then the abstract expressionists all sort of developed their style around 1947, 1948. That's when Jackson Pollock makes the drip paintings, so they're in there. And then a big part of the story, in a way, just from the point of view of world history, a much more important part of the story is decolonization. Because the high point of European empires, the point at which European states basically dominated 40% of the Earth's surface, was 1939. It wasn't in the 19th century. By 1970, those empires were gone. And almost all those colonies have become independent states. That's an enormous change. And people were preoccupied by that, needless to say. And that's an important story that I needed to tell. So I told it partly by talking about the origins of structural anthropology and Claude Lévi-Strauss. We were joking before the show about how when people talk about the book, nobody wants to talk about that chapter. But it's very important because it establishes that human differences are cultural, not biological. So that's very powerful. And then I talk about James Baldwin because, of course, he goes to Paris in 1949 and he stays there for 8 years. And he's exposed to the French post-colonialists like Frantz Fanon, and he gets to engage with their ideas about the role of race and white supremacy and so on. And then he comes back to the US and becomes a very important figure associated with the civil rights movement. So I spend time with him. A big story is the rise of rock and roll, which has been written about a million times. There's a huge literature on it. It's a fascinating story about where this music came from, but it immediately caught on around the globe. By 1957, people were dancing to rock and roll everywhere, in Singapore and Tokyo, everywhere. It really became this huge global phenomenon very early. So I talk about that, and then I talk about the Beatles. We'll talk about this a little bit later, I think, in the show. Talk about the Beatles, the effect that they had on rock and roll. And then I talk about, what else I talk about? The Feminist Movement, Betty Friedan's book, Feminine Mystique, 1963, in conjunction with Susan Sontag's first book, Against Interpretation. And she played a super important role in this general thing I'm trying to describe, which is change in American attitudes about their own culture. And I have a chapter on the movies, particularly exchange between French and American cinema. And the big figure there is Pauline Kael. I have a chapter on the New Left. And then I have a chapter which includes this exposure of the CIA secret funding of all these organizations. I end with Vietnam.
You have this term cultural winners that comes up a couple times, and I think is really useful. You don't mean that these were the people who were the best, producing the best that has been thought and said, but that they kind of contribute towards the story that is being created over this time about who we are. Can you tell me a little bit more about your kind of way of thinking about that?
Yeah, I think that my way of thinking about cultural history or intellectual history is partly biographical. And I think a lot of historians are a little nervous around biography or don't think it should take into account. But to me, it's very important because there's usually in all these cases I gave you, there's a figure who's doing a particular kind of thing. And at a certain moment, that thing becomes important to other people, and sometimes in a very outsized way. The interesting thing to try to figure out as an historian is what were the social conditions that made the possibility of doing a certain kind of art or making a certain kind of painting or a certain kind of music, writing a certain kind of book, that made that possible. And then what figure came along to realize that possibility. And that period in which the figure becomes a cultural winner, so to speak, that is, has an impact way beyond just writing a book or making a painting, is fairly short. I tend to think the lifespan of this kind of thing is about 3 years. So Jackson Pollock painted all the drip paintings in 3.5 years, 1947 to 1950. The Beatles lasted about 4 years, really, 64 to 68 or 69. That's pretty long. Baldwin's fame was actually quite short, around 60, 63, when they're just, everybody wants to know what that person's doing, everybody knows about that person's work, even if they haven't read it, and that person comes to stand for something. Rock and roll, abstract expressionism, pop art. I have a chapter on pop art too. Stand for something. John Cage, I have a chapter on him. Stand for something beyond just their own body of work. And those are the people I'm interested in because I'm trying to understand how the culture moves forward or how it zigzags forward.
Well, I guess this brings me, the question that I am particularly interested in is the role of the critic in the story, because you have the story of the art, the artists, the philosophers, everything that they're creating. That's one thing. But then a really important part of the shaping of this idea of free thought and attributing a larger meaning to all of these cultural products is really in the hands of these mid-century critics.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about Pauline Kael in the book, you talk about Lionel Trilling, Jan Wenner, as I mentioned. But yeah. People, I mean, this is, again, a disparate cast of characters working in different modes and in different contexts, but they seem to have a huge amount of power. I think a lot more than we would give critics credit for who are working now. I can't think of someone who has the influence Pauline Kael has, not just on talking about movies, but actually like who Americans think they are.
Yeah, that critics play a really big role. And, for the easy way to explain it is just to say that nobody really would know what to make of a Jackson Pollock drip painting if Clement Greenberg didn't have a theory about it. And also, or Harold Rosenberg, they both had different theories about it. But the critic is somebody who explains to the public why something's important or how to think about it. The public can be drawn to something or interested in something, but they can't interpret it without help from some critical voice. So these critics end up having tremendous authority in this period. Jan Wenner is a good example, actually. So Jan Wenner, he actually wrote reviews and essays in the early years of Rolling Stone, which starts up in 1967. But he used the magazine and the writers at the magazine to basically create the rock and roll canon. So rock and roll was really just a fad in the late 50s. Nobody thought it was going to last very long. It's just kind of pop music. But he turned it into something by creating a whole canon going back to rhythm and blues, and by taking it forward into the present day. So the Rolling Stones idea of rock and roll continues. It's like this very long period. So you need somebody like Jan Wenner who can see what's going on in that bigger perspective and then present it to listeners. So this is what you're listening to. This belongs to this whole tradition of popular music that goes, go all the way back to Robert Johnson and so on. Or Pauline Kael. So when Pauline Kael comes on the scene, she's basically without a job or can't keep a job for years and years and years. And finally, in 1967, she writes this essay for the New Yorker on Bonnie and Clyde. And there's a movie that at the time she wrote the essay, people dismissed. Kind of not a kind of unpleasant movie that didn't make any sense. She explained what it meant. She explained how to watch it. And that was what she was great at in her career. Then she starts becoming the regular critic in the New Yorker in 1968. She can explain to people who are looking at Hollywood movies, this is why this movie is entertaining, but it's also interesting for these reasons. And people needed to hear that because they needed to feel there was a reason why they were drawn to these movies. So the critic is critics should do that generally, but if you look at this period, you're right. You could just pick them out. There's people who really made a difference to making some kind of art making seem accessible to people.
Do you think there's something in the material conditions of the time that make people receptive to that kind of critical writing? Because it's one thing to say the art demands exposition because it's so difficult, but it's another to actually get people reading the New Yorker or having people be interested in reading a long book review. I mean, the audience for that is so much smaller now than it was in 1955 or something.
Yeah, I don't know if a good answer to that question. I think that maybe one way to get at what you're talking about is that in the 1950s, educated Americans were very, I would say, anxious about their response to art and music and so on. And they wanted to be sophisticated, but they didn't want to like the wrong things for the right reasons or the right things for the wrong reasons. And they were particularly interested in what an authority figure like Trilling, let's say, had to say to them about what books you should read, what books are important. So I think that's a little bit of what's going on, is this cultural insecurity a lot of Americans had. We don't have cultural insecurity anymore. We're just like, we can deal with it. So America's, that's one of the things that happened in this period. Americans feel like, I don't need to be told anymore what to like because my tastes matter. But in the 50s, people were worried about whether their tastes mattered. So I think that's part of what's going on. It's this general thing I'm trying to describe, which is that in 1945, even American intellectuals didn't think America had a civilization. By 1965, that's really started to change.
It also gets to this idea of people caring. I mean, I think the thing that struck me most in the reading and in your book is the line where you say people cared, ideas mattered, which sounds like it's a huge statement now because we're not in a moment where I think anyone would say that's quite true of the general public anymore. And I was thinking a lot about what that really means. Like, what does it mean for a large number of people to care about art? Because it doesn't mean that in the 1950s, everyone was an intellectual or that everyone was actually reading Hannah Arendt or was conversant with the existentialists. It's sort of something different. I thought your chapter on the New Yorker, or the section that you have on the New Yorker, is like this brilliant job of explaining what it means for people to be sort of like living with these ideas, but very much in the sense of, I know who Proust is.
Yeah.
I don't really need to know more than that.
Right.
I mean, you talk about the New Yorker, but are there other examples of cultural institutions of that time that you feel kind of created this atmosphere of caring about culture, but not necessarily going that much further?
Well, a lot of the little magazines, of course, did that. They have very small audiences, like Partisan Review and Commentary, Dissent. But they had the same. They were important to the people who read them. They thought, this is where I'm going to find out what's really going on. They had a lot of authority. In the case of the New Yorker, it's a different demographic, which is the New Yorker definitely was an upper quintile oriented magazine in the 1950s. It made a huge amount of money running advertisements for people who bought with Tellers or bought Chivas Regal Scotch or whatever, Lincoln Town Cars. And those people were well-educated people, but they generally were not. They were working in Wall Street or advertising or something like that, and they didn't want it. They were nervous about being expected to know a lot more about Proust than just that there was this French novelist named Proust. So it was very careful to take out anything that was knowing in their articles. I think we still do that a little bit, but that was definitely the philosophy. So anything that assumed knowledge on the part of the reader was carefully toned down or taken out or replaced by something that explained it, and it made readers comfortable. So that was a great audience for Pauline Kael to explain, why it's okay to like Bonnie and Clyde or why it's okay to like The Godfather, because those people needed to be reassured that that it was okay to do that. So yeah, so all those little magazines, as I said, even though a much smaller scale than the New Yorker, play that function. Another example is pop art, which is another thing where it just looks like a fad. What are you supposed to do with a soup can? But people came along and explained why it was important, and that that's what gave it some enough credibility to create a market for it.
Well, with both pop art and the movies, do you feel like these were these more accessible cultural forms where people did not feel challenged about watching Bonnie and Clyde, right? Like you have the line in the book, people go to the movies because they want to,
Yeah.
which is not necessarily true of reading a difficult novel or a work of philosophy. And that these critics kind of elevate those cultural products by talking about them in these more elevated terms, talking about freedom, talking about the bigger ideas that come from the other things that you talk about. They kind of creates this more highbrow conversation around something that people actually feel quite comfortable with.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Pauline Kael wasn't really highbrow because she was very anti-theory, she was very much about, as you said, she's very much about we go to movies because we like to. We shouldn't be embarrassed by that. And here's why that's a good thing. So she wasn't trying to dress it up in a way. I think that's she was actually reacting against the tendency of the more cineast kind of film critic to use concepts like the grammar of film and so on to make people feel intimidated about trying to understand a movie. She didn't use any of that kind of language. So that's part of what her appeal was. I think part of it also was interesting is that there's just a lot of interest in the avant-garde, even though people probably don't consume it, since a lot of people don't listen to John Cage's music. But everybody knows and knew who John Cage was. And they knew that he'd written this thing called the Silent Piece for Piano, which is called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. That was notorious, but people thought there must be something interesting about that. So yeah, it's just a very alive world. I think people are waking up, so to speak, in the U.S. about all the possibilities that can happen with art, and these things, and they get debated and argued about and written about. So it's just a very fun period to write about because all this stuff is going on. And then when Vietnam comes, it's just this huge dark cloud over the whole culture.
Well, speaking of things that are fun, do you want to do the next reading from the book?
Yeah. So this is from the chapter on rock and roll, and I'm going to try to not read too much of it, but this is just the opening part of it. And the idea is to set the stage for the emergence of a youth culture and then eventually rock and roll. First person to use the term youth culture was a Harvard professor, Talcott Parsons. Parsons was describing the culture of adolescence, the chief characteristic of which he identified as irresponsibility. Quote, one of its dominant notes, he wrote, is having a good time, end quote. He thought that this had a negative side, quote, a strong tendency to repudiate interest in adult things and to feel at least a certain recalcitrance to the pressure of adult expectations and discipline, end quote. Parsons was a sociologist. He wasn't judging, he was only describing. The year was 1942. That was also the year clothing manufacturers and department stores began making and marketing clothes specifically for teenage girls. 2 years later, in September 1944, the first issue of 17 came out. 400,000 copies were printed. The magazine sold out in 6 days. First agency to collect and sell data on teenage tastes opened in 1945. And that year, the New York Times Magazine ran an article entitled A Teenage Bill of Rights. The fifth right was, quote, the right to have fun and companions, end quote. The ninth right was, quote, the right to struggle towards his own philosophy of life. By 1949, the circulation of 17 was 2.5 million, more than 40% of the teenage female population in the United States. Adding in what publishers call pass-alongs, the magazine probably reached at least 500,000 more. And the term teenager had become the name for a distinctive demographic. By 1955, American teenagers were spending between $7 and $9 billion a year on fashion, food, and entertainment. As Parsons realized, for youth culture, in fact for the category of teenager itself to exist, the socioeconomic space between childhood or dependency and adulthood, parenting, and or full-time employment had to open up. As he also recognized, that space was high school. Between 1910 and 1930, high school enrollment in the United States increased by more than 400%. These were the people Parsons was writing about. In 1900, just 10% of 14 to 17-year-olds were in school. 1910, 14%. 1930, 51%. Despite the Depression, the trend continued. By 1940, 73% of Americans between 14 and 17 attended high school. This rate of growth in secondary education was unique to the United States. 1955, when 84% of high school-age Americans were in school, the figure for Western Europe was 16%. In Italy, in 1951, only 10% of all people had more than elementary school education. In 1961, the figure was 15%. In the United Kingdom, a nation with an economic profile roughly comparable to the United States, approximately 17% of 15 to 18-year-olds were full-time students in 1955. In 1957, just 9% of British 17-year-olds were still in school. So it is unsurprising that a global youth culture in the 20th century was preponderantly American. The United States had a big head start, and the sectors of American industry that capitalized on it, notably fashion and music, enjoyed a competitive advantage internationally. Already formidable in 1945, this advantage was enhanced a decade later by rapid growth in another sector of the educational system, college. Between 1956 and 1969, college enrollment in the United States increased from 2.9 million students to more than 8 million students. The growth in higher education was, again, unique to the United States because the United States was, after all, the only country with enough people in the pipeline to make it possible. In the school year 1960-61, 6.3% of all Americans under 20 were in college. In West Germany and the United Kingdom, the figure was 1.4%. Quote, America used to be the big youth place in everybody's imagination, John Lennon said in 1966. Quote, America had teenagers and everywhere else just had people, end quote. He was exactly right. Still, his remark raises an interesting question, which is why the most popular entertainers in the world in the 1960s were British.
I think that's a great question. There were so many facts in the part that you just read and in the rest of this chapter that really surprised me. I just kept discovering there were small things I didn't know and that really changed my view of this period. And I know you say rock and roll has been written about a lot, but I think this context of what did it mean to be a teenager and to be kind of anti-establishment in that teenaged way isn't necessarily discussed in this larger context of what is freedom and the Cold War. And the book, obviously,
the high school thing really helped me as well understand. I don't think that had been written about before. The high school thing, I didn't realize what a big difference there was between American high school and European high school. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, reading this, I'm from Britain and I've moved to the US as an adult. Even when I was in high school, you could leave at 16 in the early 2000s, and about half of all people did.
Yeah.
Like 80% of Americans in high school at 17?
85%. Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy high. Like, I just don't think that would even have been true when I was in high school.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that this idea of the teenager is just like a demographic thing, but also you say it's not mostly boomers. It's like the generation just before that.
Yeah, great canard. It's not the boomers. Yeah,
and the people who make youth culture, you say they're like people. Abby Hoffman's in his 30s. in the 1960s.
Abby Hoffman, who founded the Yippies, the Youth International Party, was born in 1936. So no, not a single person in my book is a boomer, including all the 60s people. Bob Dylan's not a boomer. I mean, they're born in the 40s and 30s. The whole boomer thing is just so skewed. But anyway, so all these rises in high school attendance and everything those are not boomers. The increase in high school population after 1964, that is a boomer phenomenon. Yeah, but not before that.
The other thing that struck me was that John Lennon comes off as surprisingly prescient and intellectual throughout this chapter.
Yeah.
And maybe I just haven't paid attention to that in previous reading, but the quote that you just read there, and then I think later in this chapter, he always seems to have a kind of a handle on what's happening, like this larger sense as it's happening, like at the time.
Yeah, John Lennon was a brilliant man. Oh, no question about it. And he could see the whole Beatles phenomenon from the outside. All the Beatles were very good at that. They understood what was going on, the show business part, from a sort of show business point of view. And Lennon was particularly good at that. Yeah.
So the kind of
that's contrasted with Elvis Presley, for example.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to ask you. So the whole like sort of narration of this formation of the ascendance of rock and roll, but then it becoming something more lasting and attaching itself to this bigger idea of being a kind of countercultural thing by the end of the 60s, goes from this sort of chaos with people being into Elvis Presley and like lots of young girls showing up at his concerts, to much more self-aware groups, people like the Beatles, who have a lot of distance on what's happening to them, and are able to comment on it sort of ironically, and really don't present themselves as angry young people. They present themselves much more as like
artists.
Yeah, and people who you could have a reasonable conversation with, who your parents might like,
right?
But you'll still like when you're in your mid-20s, 30s, and in fact for the rest of your life, which is what happened with most of their fans.
Yeah, they're still around. Mick Jagger's 70 something. Yeah, so I think part of the appeal, part of the reason, this is a little speculative, but I think part of the reason that these British bands like Cream and Rolling Stones and the Beatles, Donovan and so forth, why they had that ability to kind of look at what they were doing from the outside, so to speak, and why they thought of their music in more artistic terms than American rock and rollers ever thought of it, because a lot of went to art college, which is a peculiarly British institution, and no American musicians in that period even knew from art college or any kind of college. And art college gave them some idea of thinking about art as a kind of lifestyle. So they had a much more sophisticated idea, really, of what music was, I think, that most of the American figures before the Beatles came. And the Beatles brought that with them. They had a sartorial style. They had the hair. They had the weird accents Americans couldn't place, the Scouse accents. And the other thing about the British bands, this is not original with me at all. A lot of stuff this chapter is not original with me. It's just that they weren't read as appropriating black music in the way that white musicians were. When the Beatles or when Rolling Stones played songs by, or when Eric Clapton played Robert Johnson's Crossroads, people didn't think he's a white man appropriating black man's song. They thought it's an act of homage. So they kind of took race out of the equation from the American point of view when they came over here, in a way that Elvis was constantly reminding them of a white man singing black. So I think that's also part of why they got mainstream pretty easily here.
There were some other interesting contingencies that you talk about in the book, like the fact that there was this sort of series of disasters that seemed to befall American musicians, like in the year just before the Beatles come to the US, plane crashes, car crashes.
Yeah, this has also been written about a bit, is that when the Beatles come here in 1964, as everybody probably remembers, about 2 months after the Kennedy assassination, and they go on their big hit in Europe, and they go in at Sullivan, and it's this huge Beatlemania. It goes on for years. After that, they become this phenomenon. And so one of the things people have noted about that is that the rock and rollers of the late 50s, sort of Elvis types, basically all died out. Elvis went into the army for 2 years, and then he goes to Hollywood. He does not have a #1 record in the U.S. for between 1961 and I think 1969. So he's not really a presence on the pop scene in the way that he was in the 50s. And then Buddy Holly, as everybody knows, died in a plane crash. Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran, sort of more minor figures they also die or get injured in car crashes and stuff. Chuck Berry goes to jail under the Mann Act for 2 years. Little Richard quits rock and roll to become a preacher. So by 1962, 1963, the rock and roll thing is dead. It's replaced by the teen idols like Frankie Avalon. And also girl groups, Motown starts up then. And London was interested in that kind of music. When the Beatles come to the United States in 1964, the #1 album in the country is called The Singing Nun, with songs by an actual Belgian nun accompanying herself on acoustic guitar. And the #1 song in the country from that album was Dominique, if you remember it, which is sung in French. It's so remote from Elvis. So in a way, there's like an open market for what the Beatles are doing, which is sing, electric guitar, sort of rock and roll type music, dance music. And so they're not competing with anybody really when they get here.
The bigger point that I want to come back to with the Beatles coming to America to basically sing American music, or their version of it, is that this is a movement that you trace in other points in the book. Like the idea that the US sort of tries to impose its culture on the rest of the world, partly through stuff like the Congress for Cultural Freedom. But in your reading, that didn't really work.
Yeah.
And there's this more complicated process by which Europeans end up processing American culture, and then Americans imitate Europeans imitating Americans.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Yeah, so the Beatles are an example of that because they got their start as a cover band. They played American rock and roll in Hamburg and then in clubs in England, and they started to write their own songs and they performed those sometimes, but they mainly were very good imitators of American rock and roll. So they played Little Richard songs and stuff like that. So when they came to America, Paul is supposed to have said to George on the plane, what do the Americans want us for? Meaning that we're just playing American music. But of course, the Americans did not read them as American at all. They read them as European. The great example, so that's a good example of a case where we send this kind of popular art form over to Europe, and then they do something with it and bring it back, and it's almost unrecognizable when it comes back to America. And that has, of course, an effect on American music. Another classic example of this is the movies, which is, I'll try to tell the story briefly, but after the war, the United States entered into an agreement to loan France a lot of money to rebuild. This is before the Marshall Plan, 1945, and they tied to that agreement, an agreement that the French will open their theaters to American movies, Hollywood movies. So, of course, during the war, when France was occupied, you couldn't see American movies between 1940 and 1945. So when this agreement goes into effect in 1946, all these American movies like Citizen Kane and Maltese Falcon and movies that had never been seen in Europe descend on French screens. And they have a big impact on young filmmakers or would-be filmmakers like Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard, and the critics who go to create the journal Cahiers du Cinéma, and they worship American directors and they love the American movies. So when they come to make their own movies about 10 years later, Godard makes Breathless in 1960, he's trying to make an American movie. He's doing a crime couple story, which is kind of standard Hollywood genre. He knew those movies well. He was a great student of film. He'd reviewed them in Cahiers, and he wants to make a movie that's like an American movie. There's no movie that's more French than Breathless. So when it comes over here, people go like, wow, this is amazing. I want to make a French movie. And those people were Robert Benton and David Newman, who wrote the screenplay for Bonnie and Clyde. And they wrote that for Truffaut. They showed it to Truffaut, wanted him to direct it. He actually was interested. He couldn't do it, and they gave it to Godard to direct. So they thought they were making a French kind of movie. Of course, Bonnie and Clyde's the most American movie ever. So it's a great example of where we send a product over there that we don't, just trying to make money off it. And then it gets reworked in kind of this rather hip, cool way, comes back here. It's like, oh, this is different. And then it has an effect on American cultural production. So that's what I mean by how in this period, there's a lot of cultural circulation. Much more than you would expect given the very restrictive immigration policies in the United States until 1965, when they finally open up. It doesn't matter that people can't move here easily, but there's a lot of cultural exchange. One thing I didn't talk about much in the book, or really at all in the book, which I really wish I'd given a chapter to, is artistic exchange with Japan. which had a very vibrant avant-garde art scene in the 1950s, and they were very tuned into what was going on in the U.S., particularly people like Cage and Rauschenberg and so on, who went over there, and Japanese critics were interested in all of that stuff. So that's another example of where there's cultural exchanges that produce a particular product that then we call, oh, that's the American culture. But it really isn't. That's why I say it's the culture of the free world.
There are a lot of questions from the audience, and I'm sure they're all very good questions. So I'm only going to ask one more of my own, which is partly about the framing of the book and the way it will be read. You write in the preface that you were born in 1952 and that writing the book was kind of an attempt to understand the culture that you grew up with. For me, reading it, I was born in 1989, so Cold War is over or ending, right? And to me, like reading the book, I felt it's hard not to sort of feel an envy that I didn't get to live through a period when, like you say, ideas mattered this much. There's this incredible richness in culture because it seems to have, for my whole adult life, been contracting, eroding, and and languishing in many ways. In what sense is the book to you a prequel to that period? And I'm also wondering like what kinds of reactions you have had from younger people, like people who aren't of your generation, to this subject matter.
I think probably similar to yours. I wrote, so one of the reasons I wrote that, one of the things that made me write the book the way I did was that I taught this graduate course when I taught at CUNY Graduate Center in 1999 and on the 60s. And I asked the students at the end of the class, I was thinking of writing a book on the 60s, you'd be interested in that. They said, not really, but the 50s are interesting. So I realized that people just didn't know that stuff as well. When you get to the soup can and stuff, that seems banal today. Oh, yeah, you can make a painting out of a soup can. What's the big deal? But the drip paintings are a little harder to understand, I think, and Greenberg's theories and so forth. So I felt this was something that's really good to bring back to life again and try to explain to people. And then it turned out, even for me, it turned out to be a much more exciting period than even I had imagined until I got halfway through the book. So part of it, yeah, is written for people who missed it. I missed it. I was like 9 years old. I didn't know what was going on either, but I'd heard these people's names and I was curious about what they had done. I did feel, just to sort of get back, I think, to the spirit of your question, that when I finished it and we were sort of post-production, it was about to come out and everything, and then Biden got elected, I felt we might be at a phase like that now, where there's a feeling that we have a fresh start in the United States, and that we'll go from a period of kind of isolationism and nativism to more internationalism, more outreach, more welcoming to people from other parts of the world. I mean, it's going to be tough, but it feels like there's real possibilities. And there's also a possibility that the federal government would do what it used to do in the 50s and 60s, which is to enact programs that will help people. We just haven't been doing that. So I felt trying to think about the sense of promise that people had in 1945 or 1950, which we may look upon it in kind of a disdainful way, but it was real. They really felt like we can start over now. We can feel that. There's one of the figures in the book is this composer named Morton Feldman, who was a very avant-garde composer, sort of disciple of John Cage's, and he said, we thought, what is art? We could just reinvent it. That's how people thought. And I think that's a wonderful moment when that can happen in cultural history. Everything's just up for grabs for a minute. And maybe we're at that moment now. I hope I'm not speaking too soon about it. But I felt this surge of hope, that we might be at a moment like that. In which case, it's good to look back and see what people made of that opportunity 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm going to go to questions from the audience now, because as I said, there are lots of questions for you. Okay. Here's the first one. I'm going to read them out as if they are from the audience. This is from Hal Conte. Two thinkers that you concentrate much on are Jean-Paul Sartre and Hannah Arendt. Both spent time in America and both had responses to US mass culture that could be called elitist, although both admired a lot about America too. How did US mass culture benefit from the impact of such intellectuals?
So let me start the first part of that question. Hannah Arendt had no interest in mass culture or entertainment culture. She thought that the taste for that kind of thing is what she would have thought was biological. She thought the real sphere of human endeavor should be political. So she was quite dismissive of that. Didn't interest her. Sartre, on the other hand, and Beauvoir loved American movies, pre-war anyway. He named his journal Les Temps Modernes after a Chaplin movie. And they loved American music like the blues and cowboy songs and stuff like that. And they particularly loved American fiction. They loved Hemingway, Faulkner, Dos Passos, and so on, which all got translated into French in the 1930s. So it was not that they were not snobby about American culture. I think Sartre was, was an enemy of capitalism. So to the extent American culture seemed materialist to him, he would have been against it. But they did respond to American culture in many positive ways. Sartre was supposed to have done a great Daffy Duck impersonation, so whatever that's worth. So Europeans had in other words, Europeans had different relationships to American popular culture, kind of depending on what their politics were, depending on what their education was, and so on. And they were intimidating to Americans. It's part of the reason Americans had an inferiority complex about their own culture, because they thought Europeans looked down on it. Did they have an impact on American mass culture? I wouldn't say they did, really. I mean, I think there's a watered down form of existentialism that is very pervasive. But I don't, as I said, I doubt any of these people actually read existentialist philosophy.
This is a bit of a broader question. This is from David Starr. What's your working definition of freedom? Is it a noun and or a verb / process?
Yeah. So one of the things I learned as I was writing the book, I realized is that everybody uses the term freedom. Everybody's justify whatever it is their program is. And that includes not just Martin Luther King Jr., who of course uses it all the time in speeches like the I Have a Dream speech, but also George Wallace uses it when he calls for segregation. Barry Goldwater uses it. One of the most famous lines in the 60s is, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice." Barry Goldwater, that is Republican National Convention. He's a right-winger. But John F. Kennedy uses it all the time. So it's used by everybody to the point where it's basically meaningless. So if you're asking me what I think a good takeaway definition is from this period, which everybody's using it for all kinds of different purposes, because it's the slogan of the Cold War, it's the one I give in an epigraph. So the epigraph is from Tom Hayden, and he says, "We are free to the extent that we know what we're about." We are free to the extent we know what we're about. He's paraphrasing Dewey, and what it means is when we have transparency, when we can understand our situation objectively for what it is, that's freedom. That makes sense to me.
Okay, let's see. Here's another question, Stephen Shaw. I understand that Bosley Crowther was fired by the New York Times for not getting on the Bonnie and Clyde bandwagon. To what extent was taste-making a competitive sport? Yeah,
it still is, man. That's part of the game, is that you're putting your chips on a certain style, a certain work of art, and then you have to see, how the table plays and that people will react to that. So Bosley Crowther had been for people who don't know, he was the chief New York Times film critic. He started the paper, I think, in 1941 or something like that. He hated what was called gratuitous sex and violence. So he was, in that sense, he was conservative. He was a good critic in other regards, but he didn't like Bonnie and Clyde because it was a very violent movie made when the production code, which prohibited showing the kind of scenes of violence that Bonnie and Clyde show, was in suspension. So it's kind of an opening for the director, Arthur Penn, to show a lot of blood and gore. And of course, the very famous end of the movie is a slow motion massacre where Bonnie and Clyde are mowed down by the gunmen, and you can see the bullets, hitting them and everything. So that was shocking for people. They'd never seen that in an American movie before. So Bosley Crowther wrote several slams of Bonnie and Clyde in the New York Times. And then a lot of other people also slammed it. But then the movie gets revived towards the end of the years, 1967. And then it's brought out again, and it gets nominated for 10 Academy Awards. Suddenly it becomes, everybody loves it all of a sudden. And Bosley Crowther was forced to step down from the Times because of that. He's replaced by Renata Adler, who was, I think, 26 years old. So I think the Times felt, he was probably ready for retirement, but I think the Times felt that they have to get with the younger taste because the younger taste likes movies like Bonnie and Clyde, and we can't have a film critic who doesn't get it.
Okay, next question, Tom Philpott. Curious about whether the book gets into the CIA's role of packaging and popularizing post-war US culture for overseas markets, stuff like Stephen Spender's CIA-funded Encounter, Louis Armstrong's European tours, etc.
I do. So the CIA from 1950 on was covertly funding all kinds of organizations, not just cultural stuff, but also a lot of political organizations, most famously the National Student Association. And in 1967, Ramparts magazine basically pulls the thread on this whole covert tapestry by exposing the CIA support of the National Student Association. And then after that, all these other things come to light that the CIA had created these dummy foundations which would donate money to various things the CIA wanted to support. So the Encounter magazine was an organ of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is supposedly an independent organization based in Paris to promote cultural freedom. And they had magazines in most European countries. There was one in Germany, France, and Britain. The British one was called Encounter. And almost every American intellectual wrote for Encounter. I have a list of the people in my book who wrote for it. Almost every famous person wrote for Encounter. In 1967, it's revealed that this was magazine, the whole Congress for Cultural Freedom was a creature of the CIA. And all these magazines were also creatures of the CIA, and that the editor of Encounter was the CIA agent. So all these intellectuals who have been writing for Encounter were like, what? We're being paid by the CIA for our essays? It was a big, everything blew up at that moment. Christopher Lasch wrote a great essay about it. He said it just shows what a sham it was. Intellectuals who thought they were independent were actually saying exactly what the government wanted them to say. So I do talk about that, because along with Vietnam, that was a moment. Suddenly the whole thing starts to unravel at that moment. This whole period I'm talking about gets looked at in a completely different way. I want to talk just for a second because it's about something in this question, because it's important, is that there's a line that's been repeated since 1970s. The CIA was behind promoting abstract expressionism, and it's really not true. To the extent the CIA was involved in exhibitions of American art abroad, or the government was involved in it, they wanted to promote the idea of a diversity of styles. They didn't want to pick out one style as an official or American style, because there was an official Soviet style, socialist realism, and they wanted to show that in the US you could paint anything you want, any way that you want. We don't have an official, aesthetic. So they did not promote Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionists exclusively. And there's no evidence anybody at the CIA even thought about that way. The abstract expressionists had much less impact on world art and European art than pop art. Pop art was a sensation from the beginning. It traveled around the world. Everybody imitated it. That was the American art that really colonized the world, not abstract expressionism.
Well, just to follow up on that question, because our reviewer mentioned this, that you felt that despite the American government's attempts to promote the kind of highbrow exports, these were not actually incredibly successful.
Yeah.
It's something I've always wondered about, like why the CIA would fund little magazines, because even at their best, not many people read them.
The CIA, so the CIA, this goes to the question of the cultural Cold War in Western Europe. The CIA wanted to support left-wing people who were anti-communist, because they wanted to show people like Jean-Paul Sartre, left-wingers, it's okay to be left-wing and anti-communist in the US. We're okay with that, as long as you're anti-communist. So Partisan Review, for example, was a left-wing anti-communist journal in the 1940s and 1950s. So from the government point of view, it's a little unclear whether they really did support it, but there's some evidence that they did. From the government point of view, that's exactly the kind of intellectual we want to show the world that is allowed to exist in the United States. We're not censoring people who have left-wing views. We're only concerned that those views be anti-totalitarian, anti-communist. So anything that fit that bill, and usually it was very progressive stuff. So the CIA funded Norman Thomas's Socialist Party. Thomas didn't even know the money was coming from the CIA because they wanted to support any socialist organization that was anti-communist. Part of what happens by 1967 is that, with the National Student Association, is that suddenly these organizations want to be against the war in Vietnam, which is government policy, which the CIA can't pay for. So that's part of why this crisis arises. But I think that helps to explain why they support places like Partisan Review.
Here's the next question. Let's see. How do you feel about this? This is an anonymous question, although I don't think it's anonymous for any ominous reason. How do you feel about the state of criticism today? How do you think it has been aided or impeded by the rise of the internet / technology at large?
It's flourishing. It's all over the place. When I started out, in the world of print, there were maybe 5 or 6 places, New Republic was one of them, where if you wrote a review, people would read it. Everybody read it, because there were only a few places like that. New York Times Book Review, TLS, little magazines like Nation and so on. There was just a few of them. So a very small number of people basically called the tune about stuff. Now, it's everybody gets to call the tune. There's a zillion sites that have serious cultural commentary on them. Educated cultural commentary, as good as anything you can get in a print magazine. So I think it's in great shape. What it doesn't have is sort of presiding figures and voices and stuff like that, but why is that not a better thing? So no, I think it's doing well. People consume it, they like it.
Maybe not such a good thing for the people who'd like to be the presiding voices, but well, that's on them.
That's okay.
Okay, I know we're over the time, so I'm just going to ask one more question from the audience. This is from Patricia Heller. Would you care to comment on Evan Kindley's review, noting that freedom once motivated a great deal of valuable activity, but that you seem unconvinced that freedom itself has any intrinsic value?
I just said this a minute ago, what I think its value is. But if you're trying to draw a lesson from the period about adding up what everybody thought about it, you're not going to come up with anything. But I think I'm a Deweyite, so I think that transparency is the ability to understand yourself, your situation, and see clearly the state of social relations around you. It's a Marxist idea too. To me, that constitutes freedom.
Yeah. Just to follow up on that, because the preface strikes this note of doubt or of questioning. Questioning, what does this really mean?
Yeah.
And I think, in the book, you point to the Vietnam War as being an event that really cracks open a lot of these questions. But there's a lot of time between then and you sort of embarking on the book. Was there a more recent moment, like a kind of turning point for you, where you felt like these questions seem really pressing? For me, I wondered if something that was hovering in the background was a lot of the talk about freedom in the 2000s, in the Bush era, when I think that word came to seem very tarnished, the idea of America being the leader of the free world. And I wondered what the context was for have the questioning of what freedom is in America. Yeah,
so freedom right now is kind of a right-wing slogan. It's freedom not to wear a mask, freedom to carry a gun. That's sort of the motto on the right. So on the left, the mottos are that have to do with equality, social justice, and so forth. So that's, in a way, it's a more sensible division of values than in the 60s, where everybody's saying we're for freedom. In my case, it's not that interesting, but you go to graduate school, you start reading sociology, you start to wonder what is autonomy? Does that mean anything? I kind of think it doesn't mean a whole lot. That life is just heteronymous through and through. But I think that everybody feels subjectively, there are moments when you feel that you have some kind of agency or some kind of freedom to make choices. I think the Sartrean idea is extreme, but I sort of get what he's trying to say, which is that we're always free to make a choice as long as we take responsibility for that choice. We don't have to feel anything's determining us to make that choice. We can make it of our own volition. So I get that. I understand what that feeling is. What the reality is sociologically, I'm not really sure. But the feeling's important to people. They know what it means to be deprived of it. That's how the book ends. That's what happened to the South Vietnamese. They were deprived of it. So to me, that's important. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a great answer. And there are more questions, but I don't have time to ask them. But I'm sure that Luke will be doing more events around his book, and that there'll be more chances to ask him more about the book and, of course, to read it. So thank you so much for joining us. I wish that I could have asked you more, because I feel like I only got to touch on a tiny little tip of the iceberg of this.
Yeah, it's a big book. There's a lot to talk about, but the questions were great. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming and watching.
Okay, thank you. Have a good night.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.